Nā mana e rau rangatira mā e tangata whenua o te whanganui a tāra e ngā mihi, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai ki te whare te wahi a mahi e Aotearoa, ko Hamish McDougall ahau. Greetings everybody. As the Executive Director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, it's my great pleasure to welcome you along this evening for what should be a really fascinating and also fundamentally important discussion for the next hour or so. Special welcome, of course, to our very important guests, who I'll introduce formally in a moment. But it's great to be here today to discuss international gender equality and addressing the rights of women and girls, and in particular this discussion on what next for sexual and reproductive health rights. I think as the numbers of you here testify, there's obviously plenty of interest in this topic, and it's great and a privilege for the Institute to be able, firstly, to cover the topic and to have such two high calibre speakers. We are, of course, just coming off International Women's Day 2024, and this year is the 30th anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, which saw 179 UN member states agree that reproductive health, women's empowerment and gender equality are foundation stones of sustainable development. As the sort of text preamble for this event makes clear, the last 3 decades has been some really good progress in those areas, but there is now a danger of that progress slowing, stopping, and in some cases reversing. And I think we can expect to hear quite a bit more shortly as to why that's happening and what can be done to overcome it. And the role that New Zealand plays in all this is also of interest. I did note that about a week ago, the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade released a report written by an advisory group consisting of Colin Keating, Rosalind Norman, David Cappy and Velmain Toki, which offered a range of new and enhanced foreign policy tools for the New Zealand government to consider. And one of the really interesting recommendations that's pertinent to tonight is that New Zealand take a much more proactive, preventative approach to international human rights issues, including enhancing its development work and collaborating with the UN and other multinational institutions. So it's my particular privilege to welcome firstly Dr. Natalia Kanem to speak to us here today. Dr. Kanem is the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, and she's extensive expertise in science, public health and philanthropy. She oversees an organisation that works in over 120 countries with the aim of ensuring that every pregnancy is intended, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. The Executive Director, Dr. Kanem, will speak shortly for about 10 minutes or so to set the scene, and then she'll be followed by the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who of course needs very little introduction to a New Zealand audience. After a long career in Parliament, she was Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008, and then the United Nations Development Programme Administrator from 2009 to 2017, the first woman to hold that role. She is, of course, a much respected global leader in sustainability, sustainable development, gender equality and international cooperation. And in 2019, she became the patron of the Helen Clark Foundation, which over the last 5 years has been a really good contributor to New Zealand's think tank scene. The conversation will include a discussion amongst our 2 speakers, and then we'll go to an audience Q&A, so you get a chance to pose your own questions. And then I'll ask Carly Mercier, the Deputy Director of the Helen Clark Foundation, to say a vote of thanks at the end. A number of you here, it might be your first event with the Institute, and I really do encourage you to stay involved with what we're doing. We do around 80 events such as this across the country every year. We do research publications, analysis and so forth. We've got a range of membership options. We hope to see you again. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Natalia Kanem.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, Hamish. Kia ora. Thank you, Hamish. and certainly thank you, Right Honorable Helen Clark. Good afternoon, everyone. I greet you in peace. Peace, after all, is the noble purpose of the United Nations. It's also the dearest wish of every woman, every girl around the world today. And I am really happy to be here with you back in Wellington and having the opportunity, hosted by the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, to engage with you on such a vital and timely subject, such as sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this is a moment, the weekend after we've celebrated International Women's Day, to recall that journey that started 30 years ago. And I was present as a young professional in Cairo at that international conference on population and development, which vibrated with unbridled excitement and expectation. The landmark conference on population and development put on the table, and it was unanimous among the member states, that reproductive health, women's empowerment, gender equality are pillars of sustainable development. In Cairo, the discussion about population not only being about numbers, but about people, the human lives that population dynamics and statistics describe. Cairo shifted the emphasis of the United Nations and of the movement for sexual and reproductive health towards human rights, and putting in particular the rights of women and girls at the center of development, the dignity and the well-being of individuals. And in keeping with the United Nations Charter, the understanding that women, couples, have the right to decide freely about whether, when, with whom to have children, the exercise of autonomy over one's own body, and living free from violence as natural human rights in the possession of each and every human being around the world. So now I fast forward for interests of time. 30 years later, it's 2024. And the landscape has shifted dramatically. Yes, there has been enormous progress to celebrate, albeit unevenly distributed. More girls are now in school than ever before. More have access to comprehensive sexuality education that is culturally appropriate, that is age appropriate, and that is part of the defense of their bodily integrity. We are at a moment where more people can actually avail themselves of quality reproductive health services. And in fact, there are more options than ever in terms of choosing one's life trajectory. And I'll describe a girl who UNFPA met in Mozambique. Her name is Tokasana. Because of this movement that started in Cairo and the understanding about the centrality of women and girls, Tokasana escaped from what would have been predetermined for her to have been married off at an early age, leading to early childbearing. And now this is a girl who is mentoring others in her community while she herself is pursuing her dream to work as a doctor. There's another girl in the Democratic Republic of Congo who is an activist working on sexual and gender-based violence to end that scourge in her community. And she's rallying the men in that community to be defenders of girls rather than victimizers. And on to Bolivia, where we've supported an award-winning project. It's called Self-Discovered, and it's providing indigenous and first-generation students with information and with the peer-to-peer relationship advice that allows that community in Bolivia to combat high teen pregnancy rates and sexual abuse. This girl called Magali in that community is ensuring that future generations understand their rights, that they have the tools, that they know about the opportunities to make an informed decision. Sexual and reproductive health is something that is very intimate. It is very close to the family, and it is very personal. And this is precisely why we defend individual human rights across a range of sexual diversities, abilities, and disabilities, and make it clear that this is an inherent human right to bodily autonomy and bodily integrity. So for me, that is the promise of Cairo. For me, that is fundamental for the United Nations as we look at SDG 3 on health to immediately look at SDG 5 on gender equality, full equality. And it's also a promise that plays out in the lives of women and girls. But of course, women and girls' lives affect everyone in the family, everyone in the community, and hopefully in an additive way to the type of leadership that someone like the Right Honorable Helen Clark portrays. That confidence to be able to understand and listen to what it is that communities are saying and to distill that into the kind of collective action that actually makes a difference, and it's practical things that make a difference. And SRHR is a practical thing. UNFPA focuses on 3 so-called zeros because the evidence, the science, the data, and what women on the ground have told us time and time again shows the empowerment of being able to choose contraception and be able to space your children according to your wishes. Interestingly enough, we're now at a moment where there's diversity in terms of population, and the converse of that, infertility. If a woman wishes to have children, let us make sure that we do everything in our power to assist her individual desire. That's the first zero, to assure that women can meet their reproductive ideals. Zero preventable maternal deaths is part of the journey from Cairo. Fully a third less deaths during childbirth in this era than there would have been 30 years ago. Big cause for celebration. When a woman dies in childbirth, the family, of course, is affected. The remaining children, the ecosystem of her village, of her community. But when a woman dies in childbirth, it tells you that many women didn't die, but they met drastic results on the way. Childbirth should be normal and natural and safe, and the health system, from the primary to the secondary care to the tertiary care, that pays attention to making childbirth safe means that other things are also working. And midwifery is part of the magic solution. And in New Zealand, of course, you're well aware of this. And this is something that UNFPA trains for and kind of proselytizes as we go around the world, that midwives save lives and they're community-based and they know how to organize a health system. And that's part of conquering maternal mortality. Part of conquering maternal mortality is also admitting that when the woman who dies in childbirth dies, much of the time she was a girl. She was an adolescent who didn't stand a chance in terms of early marriage, early pregnancy, and also the lack of care with care that young people can face when they're stigmatized by early pregnancy, when they're stigmatized by the type of ignorance that some people would call innocence, but you're not innocent if you're pregnant. Now the innocence has vanished and you are put in a different category. So the type of loving care that, for example, the teenage school health, the teenage schools for young moms that you have here in New Zealand, very instructive in terms of helping young people to see the bright future ahead of them, even as a young mother. That should not close the door on opportunity. The last zero, I'm sure, when Helen and I have our conversation, you will grapple, as we do, with the understanding that the harsh reality is 1 in 3 women are affected by gender-based violence. This is the opposite of peace in the home. This is the opposite of peace in the community. This is certainly the opposite of the big peace that the world needs for our development aims to come to fruition. In that type of violence, I absolutely include things like female genital mutilation and child marriage, which harms girls. And we have to look at the social impact of this to understand that it's not just that you're immature physically. It's not just that you're not prepared to be a parent for the next generation. Your economic future, so much else really rides on your ability to get an education as an adolescent girl in a competitive world where AI is around the corner. So this understanding of child marriage as a harm is something that we also have to discuss, and it's all going to take quality data, disaggregating that data so we know who's being left behind and why. I do celebrate the gains that the United Nations has been able to spearhead with member states like New Zealand taking the lead on something like gender equality, which makes a difference on the ground. I also really believe that when we think about stigma for something like HIV, up to and even including COVID, it's always gendered. And the epidemic of violence that we saw during a time when people were confined has social roots, and we have to look for root causes, not just put the Band-Aid on, but to understand how are we going to change human relationships so that respectful, right, non-gendered respect for persons is going to be fundamental in society. I would also like to note that leadership makes a huge difference. This is how we have changes in law and policy, which hopefully, after enactment, are put into practice so that we see things like protection of reproductive rights, access to safe abortion, to comprehensive sexuality education, and every measure against gender-based violence, which now 100 governments have seen fit to legislate against gender-based violence, and that's much different than it was in Cairo 30 years ago. So let me just observe that while we celebrate progress and the glass is half full, every 2 minutes someone dies needlessly in pregnancy and childbirth. More than 250 million women who are seeking contraception because they would like to space or avoid pregnancy are not able to do so. And for that 1 in 3 woman who experiences violence during times of humanitarian crisis, whether it's weather-related or conflict-related, women and girls bear the brunt of frustration in society. This is something where men have to step up, and every sports club, every police training, every military training has to emphasize the protection and the safety of women and girls in each and every instance. So let me close by just asking, and it is a rhetorical question, why must women wait a day longer to control their own bodily autonomy? 30 years after Cairo, must women wait to escape gender-based violence and online harm when we reproduce in social media social harm that has a real-life effect? So yes, the terminology of technology-facilitated gender-based violence adds another jargon that I apologize for because we have to speak in simple language that anyone can understand. Shaming people and bullying them online, stalking them, et cetera, and threatening people, which female politicians very often face. This is all wrong. It's something that humans have created and that we had better change moving forward. My last point is that the climate crisis, where New Zealand is, again, a leader on the world stage, is also gendered. AI may not tell you when you plug in who is a farmer that nearly half of the world's agricultural producers are female, right? And so when we think about who's affected by drought, when you have repeated cyclone events, as you've had in the Pacific neighborhood here, and also in parts of Africa, who is displaced? Who's got to start from scratch? Who is vulnerable to being trafficked? All of these are questions that we have to ask and answer. It's a happy thing that as the world is more young, we have 1.8 billion young people, more than ever before in the course of human history. We also have more people who are older, over the age of 60, than ever before. So thank you to modern medicine, better nutrition, and so much social good that has come out of discussions like the one we're having here at NZIIA. We also have to understand, though, that it's also the first time in human history where some countries' populations are shrinking. And we've coined this term demographic anxiety, so that once again, women are not blamed for now having too few children, where maybe, in other years you had too many or whatever it is. This is an individual guaranteed choice by human rights. And I think as countries get to below fertility, it opens up a whole new arena for discussion of quality of life and the cycle of life, because you can't have a happy old age and get to be 102 if you start attending to what's happening to older people in old age. It actually probably starts prenatally, but certainly your diet in childhood, your ability to have, productivity on your job, et cetera, is going to add up to a pension plan or, social goods as the world ages. I also believe that the trend towards delaying childbearing may spur new creativity. Young people are thinking about assisted reproductive technology in ways that we didn't have before. Egg freezing and these types of things are coming into the mainstream, much like IVF would have in decades gone by. Our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, identifies in his 5 megatrends that affect the world for discussion in September at the Summit of the Future at the United Nations, demographic dynamics. Demographic change is indeed one of the 5 megatrends that will shape our future, the other ones being climate change, urbanization, inequalities, and then the rapidity of technological change, right? So as we think about the effect on things like migration, as we think about the effect of, for example, climate change on research suggesting that 1 degree Celsius in the week before delivery, when it's hot, like coming from Melbourne, it was 41 degrees there yesterday, record-setting heat, that something like this before delivery can actually contribute to stillbirths. So there's a lot of understanding, there's a lot of deepening of what we know and correlating that with natural phenomena as we try to keep that balance. For me, it's clear that women are not going back. The debate about reproductive rights and choices belongs with those who are most affected. And it is up to me in the United Nations, in my own community, speaking with my own faith leaders, and certainly engaging with young people who are really imaginative. And obviously your reproductive years and your productive years overlap. You're building a career while you're building a family. Will businesses respond appropriately to this? It's incumbent on all of us to remember that there was a lot of wisdom in that Cairo ICPD Programme of Action, which said, also, let us work together to achieve these goals. And as such, I do hope to see the issues that relate to sexual diversities, the disability communities, insistence on nothing about us without us, all figuring prominently in the Pact of the Future that will be one of the outcomes of the Summit of the Future in September. Loving Proverbs as I do, I was very happy to be told a Maori proverb that says, seek the treasure you value most dearly, and if you bow your head, let it be towards a lofty mountain. Because our ambition for women and for an adolescent girl needs to be as high as the sky. We do need to look up to the lofty mountain and assure that all of the good things of this earth are preserved and are prioritized in the life of an adolescent girl. That is part of the beauty of diversity. That is part of the beauty of respect and upholding human rights. There is no going back. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Natalia, and how wonderful it is to see you here. As you will have noticed, coming down to New Zealand, we are quite a long way from anywhere. And so having senior UN officials come down is really special, and you follow in great footsteps. When I was Prime Minister for 3 terms, each term Thuraya Obeid, who was the head of UNFPA, used to come and visit me. And it's important because it keeps the agency on the radar of our foreign ministry, of politicians. And it's good to know that New Zealand is still giving UNFPA good support. It's, we're a small country, so it's not the mega bucks of the budget, but it's been a reliable contributor, and that's what you need. Natalia's covered so much. The reference to 102 years and demographic, what was the phrase? Demographic dynamics. I'm quite exhausted by the organisation of my father's 3 102nd birthday parties in recent days. So I think with that genetic inheritance, I'll be around bugging people for a while. But what I came to appreciate all those years ago when Thuraya used to come and call on me was just how important the UN Population Fund's mandate is. And as Natalia has said, it really takes its sort of, lodestar, I suppose, from the Cairo conference. One of the sad things is we haven't been able to update Cairo, which is now 30 years ago. And we'll get into some of this in the discussion. But the environment for tackling all the emerging issues that have come on the agenda since Cairo has not always been so positive. And I think in some ways, UN Population Fund probably has the most challenging mandate of all the UN agencies, because as Natalia set out, it champions the full range of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And as we know, that's not everybody's cup of tea. It's certainly my cup of tea. But the right to that comprehensive set of rights is not acknowledged by everyone. And it can become a political football which affects UNFPA's funding. For example, no Republican administration in the United States from and including the time of Ronald Reagan has funded UNFPA. When the Democrats come back, the tap's turned on. But, from one election to the next, you don't quite know what's coming. So it's a challenging environment. So really, the struggle for universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights is so interwoven with the battle for gender equality, for women to have their full human rights upheld, the right to determine their choices, my body, my choice. And it's just, so wonderful to have a UN agency that is dedicated to upholding these fundamental human rights. I also want to acknowledge all the work that UNFPA does with young people. One of my hats at the moment is chairing the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, and UNFPA is one of the core UN agencies which is represented in our membership and family, and Natalia has been personally very, very, very supportive. We ran a major campaign last year for adolescent health and well-being, and UNFPA is the go-to UN agency around these kinds of issues. So Natalia is a courageous woman, and she needs to be, with the mandate that she has got. Really a fearless advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights and youth, and for gender equality and for bodily autonomy. And I think we're just so lucky to have her here, reminding us of the importance of these causes and the importance of our country continuing to support them. So I'm going to come in then to a kind of a conversation, and because we're we're a bit crowded down the front. I might sort of stand here and let Natalia sit, because she is on the last leg of a long mission. They have been in Japan, Korea, Australia, and here, and they're on the plane back to San Francisco and on to the Commission on the Status of Women this coming week. But if we come, Natalia, to this anti-rights movement that has emerged, and it's kind of interesting that with a body like the Commission on the Status of Women, which was always so open to the NGO world, it used to be the women's NGOs, progressive NGOs that came, and now those other voices are very, very loud around the edges and fringes of these kinds of meetings. So what, in your view, is causing this pushback against the rights of women and the rights of youth and the rights to sexual and reproductive health, and what can we do about it? Up to you.
Well, thank you, Helen, and thank you also for underscoring the importance of international solidarity and why it is that New Zealand really is a treasure to the United Nations as a whole, but also to UNFPA. Because regardless of your administrations, this commitment to making sure that the women and girls are okay, and the leadership of New Zealand, of female politicians, of course, is legendary and appreciated. And I always retell the story of when former Prime Minister brought her baby to the floor of the United Nations, how affirmed as a staff we were, but the reverberations in other world gatherings, that yes, mothers and babies are welcome at the United Nations and everywhere else. This should be like the new normal, if you will. Helen, with your vast experience, I would bet that you would agree. Part of the reason that we're seeing pushback is because there's been such big progress, right? Human social movements kind of build up, and then you have these leaps ahead. And not everybody is going to be 100% happy all the time, and that's not the point. The point is that the march should be in a forward direction. For me, these anti-rights groupings, I wouldn't call a movement, because the movement of people is actually towards fairness and justice, harmony, happiness, and working together. But powerful influences, right, can be brought to bear when there's big progress and it's seen as an obstacle. Divide and rule is always going to be part of the dynamic that we have to face. And very clearly, I think the dramas that we're seeing are orchestrated to invoke fear, to get people worried about what might be happening with a girl on a sports team, rather than thinking about how are we going to work together and really protect a health system that can be faltering. So ultimately, I think that history does show when you make big progress, you have to be prepared for a reaction. And look, the average person is not going to have access to all the wealth of data and debate, that you have at the institute or that I would have, at my desk. But the average person is actually pretty smart, and they sort of know how to prioritize what should happen for themselves and their family. And with all due respect, because you did use the Republican administrations as an example, Republican administrations, yes, they've defunded UNFPA, but we have persevered. And in fact, I think the Me Too movement, the movement to protect abortion rights, has actually shown decisively that women will vote in their own self-interest. And this has been true in the modern few months as it has been over time. For us, our basic belief is that we have to provide the information and tell the truth as we see it. Young people really are, I think, deserving of our trust because they are not only smart and imaginative and use their ingenuity, but every generation espouses an idealism. And if that flame can be nurtured and kept alive, some of us keep it, into later stages. But how disappointing for a young person to be bullied and shamed and, kind of set aside when they're struggling with trying to understand the world around them. And this is why I think for issues of human rights, this new upcoming generation, which cares about climate to the point where they're willing to demonstrate on the streets, which cares about other human beings, so that yes, the identity of a queer person is much more nurtured and protected in a younger generation than it will be in the older age groups. And I think what we really need to do is to assure that, the opposition to women's rights, the dramatic spike in homophobic and especially transphobic rhetoric meets its match with the truth, right? And the disinformation and the misinformation has to be attended to. You don't ignore it. You have to assert the opposite. And sometimes, I think it is hard. You do feel like you're sticking out like a sore thumb, waving your hand and saying, no, I actually don't agree, and here is the reason why. But we have to cross the street and persuade the person that doesn't agree. And we should all be willing to be humble enough to do that. And I hope that that's going to be part of the process of dialogue around the world for ICPD 30 this year. Thanks.
Very good. As is obvious to all of us as we turn on our television every night, the world is suffering from many, many conflicts. And I think a role of UNFPA that needs to be highlighted here is how important it is in the humanitarian response with the dignity kits for women and trying to ensure that basic services are delivered to women in the most desperate of circumstances. I think, Natalia, people would be really interested to hear a little about the kind of work you're trying to do, your advocacy around Gaza, around women under threat in Ukraine and so many other desperate situations.
Our Secretary General has asserted time and again that the place to resolve conflicts is at the diplomatic dialogue table, not resorting to warfare. And it's highly concerning that we're manufacturing more refugees, more displaced people situation, et cetera, et cetera. And this has to be addressed as a root cause. For New Zealand, which provides very generous humanitarian support financially, but also strategically, when our office in Fiji sits around the table and decides how do we pre-position supplies and equipment, what should be the priority areas, New Zealand is a very important partner in that discussion. For UNFPA, the humanitarian system, the United Nations, the Red Cross, etc., when we sit around the table as humanitarian agencies, our entrusted areas of responsibility have to do with, again, sexual and reproductive health and rights, making sure that pregnancy is safe, even in a place like Gaza right now. And it was also true in Ukraine, where we saw, sadly, maternity hospitals targeted by bombing and violence. The midwife is geared up to be able to go out there, even if she has to deliver on a plastic sheet in the middle of nowhere, to help hold that woman's hand during childbirth, to look after the newborn, and in concert with UNICEF, to do our level best to make sure that there's shelter, that there's protection. The dignity kits that you mentioned are very, very, very appreciated. And again, in thanking the government and the people of New Zealand for caring about a girl who's menstruating in the middle of a conflict and she's fleeing for her life, being able to have a towel and a shawl and, hygiene supplies, soap, toothbrush, menstrual pads, it just preserves a little bit of that human dignity that you need to be able to keep that little flame of hope alive while, conflict that you certainly didn't create is swirling around you. The second really, and this is the saddest days of my life, is when you have to take testimony from someone in Myanmar, someone in Sudan, someone anywhere in the world, because actually, even if it's a question of earthquake or hurricane or whatever, women and children are going to bear the brunt of gender-based violence that, for whatever reason, accompanies frustrations. And now, in addition to everything else you're dealing with, you've been beaten up by your partner and whatever. You might have physical injuries, but that anguish that this woman, that this girl feels. And Helen, I think, I've had to get over squeamishness in discussing rape in conflict. It happens, and unfortunately, it happens regularly. And I often think, in other wars, people would come back and they would talk about the horrors of war, and you would imagine whatever you imagined. Now, we're in real time seeing what happens to women and girls, and it's just horrendous and has to be denounced and refuted. And again, the root cause of why should sexual violence be part of a conflict? This means we're not training people properly when they are a police person, when they are a military person. There are, rules of conduct, there are codes of conduct, and there's international humanitarian law that has to be adhered to. One thing that's also kind of, on the the ability to have a safe space, which is what we call the tent, where a woman can go and sort of have a moment of respite, be listened to by a counselor, be referred to services that she may need, a social worker or a lawyer or something like that. These safe spaces are part of the tradition that UNFPA preserves, even in the middle of a lot of upheaval. And usually they're women-led, women-run. UNFPA localizes our agenda. This is something that New Zealand has advised over time. The local community usually knows best what's going to work best. So 40% of our humanitarian resources are distributed through the hands of women-led CSOs, civil society organizations, sometimes through youth-led organizations. It means we have to account for how the funds are being resourced. We have to do an extra layer of due diligence to show that it's well used. But it's really an advantage for us to be local on the ground before conflict, usually during and after. Thanks, Helen.
Well, last question from me. We're living through what's sometimes described as a polycrisis. We've been through a once-in-a-century pandemic. We have this range of terrible conflicts, and we have a climate crisis. And all of them represent setbacks in the march towards the Sustainable Development Goals, in which further reduction of maternal mortality and so on are such important goals. Can we get there? 2030 is not that far away. What can we do to speed up progress?
It's gotten harder, but that doesn't mean that we change the benchmark. We don't move the goalposts. I think we have to figure out how do we accelerate progress to make up for, like you're saying, we've had some momentous, hopefully once in a lifetime pandemic, et cetera, occurrences. I'm really excited about the prospect of uniting several things that are also new on the landscape, including the positive promise of new technology. As the world is aging, for example, what creative things are we going to do to make life easier and better for mobility, right? As I think about telemedicine, and I happen to be a medical doctor, I come from Panama, which is also a seafaring country. I'm delighted to be back in New Zealand every time. Even a small country with challenges like we have in the Pacific, the distances, et cetera. The telemedicine, the teletraining, the ability to shorten those distances with technology is huge, and there's big promise there. UNFPA is also doing a lot of outreach to businesses, because we think that when business mainstreams a practice, people accept it better. And for example, as I was coming here, the former vice chancellor of part of this institution was telling me that there was childcare on site somewhere nearby for the employees and the faculty to be able to drop off their child. This actually is something we just tested with Accenture, the consulting company, in the lead up to the World Economic Forum this year. We've launched a program to encourage businesses to think more intelligently about your productive workforce, that you want to have higher productivity for your bottom line. Well, it turns out that doing things like putting the child care, the breastfeeding room, allowing people to take time off for sexual and reproductive health matters, making it convenient for someone with HIV to take their medication. We are scaling this so it's not just the great big company, but the employers and communities can think through a measurement index. We're big on data, we're big on metrics. How do I know that I'm a good employer? And for these SRHR indicators, according to Accenture, our partner for the research, the happiness index of the employee shoots up, and productivity in the first year of testing went up by 22% by doing these 6 things, which are the metrics of SRHR on the job. So you can legitimately take your parental leave if you're a man without us pointing at you and saying, oh my gosh, are you loyal to the company? Yes, you are, because you're raising your child and you're home during that early period. So there's no stigma attached to it. Similarly, if you need to come back to work after your maternity leave, the guarantees that you'll be reaccepted. There's so many things which also help you to attract talent. People, it turns out, really want to work for companies that have that caring environment. I think we're going to get there also because the opposite is just too terrible to contemplate. And that certainly spurs me to do my little tiny bit towards a more peaceful, harmonious society. I admire your region and how you manage to really get together, discuss the big topics, but also you seem to have fun when you're together. I've been invited, for example, to the disabilities gathering. It was in Fiji the year when I went. Really smart people, lots of allies along with people with disabilities. And a lot of what I learned there reverberates even up until now. I now am well aware that sexual well-being is just as much a part of life for somebody who lives seated in a wheelchair or has a mental disability or whatever as it is for anyone else. We all have the same human rights, right? So I am very excited to consider that the models that you have here, climate change activism, right? The cooperation that you have with your Pacific neighbors, and also an emphasis on policy that is family friendly and gender sensitive. This is actually, part of the index of happiness and having a better world, which really is going to mean lots more cooperation. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted always to have the opportunity to interact. Thanks. Thank you.
Hamish, over to you for some audience.
Yes, yeah. Who would like to pose a question?
Does he need the mic? Yes.
Thank you for coming. You've spoken about kind of state conflict, such as in the Ukraine and Gaza. What do you say for regions which are currently in conflict, like Afghanistan, which don't respect the rights of women with sexual and reproductive health issues?
Should I take the first one? Yeah. For UNFPA, as I mentioned, very often we're in a location, Afghanistan, for example, before conflict arises or recurs, and we stay and we serve from within. And then hopefully once it's resolved, we're part of the resolution, we're part of the reconstruction. My team in Afghanistan is working day and night to deliver services along the lines of what I described for sexual and reproductive health, safe pregnancy, etc. And the entire UN has spoken to the fact that gender equality within the country and everywhere else in the world is a fundamental principle. And when we're in any country, we have to maneuver within the laws, in the case of Afghanistan, the local authorities. However, our Secretary General And so many other arms have joined with us in saying that girls' education is so vital. And the full respect for women, including women who are part of the workforce. So whether in Afghanistan or anywhere else, human rights are indivisible, they are universal, and we advocate vigorously for girls to go back to school. Can I just give you a practical consequence of this type of short-sightedness that our Secretary General has spoken to in the specific incidents of Afghanistan? In order to become a midwife and help to safely deliver a baby, and these are very heroic people, midwives save lives wherever they are, this midwife is going to climb the mountain in the wintertime, and she's going to help deliver that set of twins or whatever we call on her to do. If we don't have girls in school, and male midwives obviously are not going to be producing are not going to be admitted into a midwifery program in that country, who is going to deliver the baby after we run out of midwives in the next X amount of years? So I think there are really practical consequences to denying girls their education inherently, but also in terms of how is society going to run if women are not educated and equipped to co-lead society. I also would like to emphasize that for the UN staff that works in humanitarian circumstances around the world, there's a selflessness to this group where I have to insist that they take their R&R, that they take their leave when it's due. You know, they so much want to help to make things better, which is part of the respect that I have for the humanitarian staff, and safeguarding them from harm is one of my big duties. I mean, their security is actually, you know, part of what I worry about literally every day. So again, we're very cautious to work within the limitations that we're given. We are not the ones that are the change makers in Afghanistan, but we really try to insist that human rights be respected in every instance. Thanks. Thank you for caring.
Should we go down the far end?
Kia ora, Dr. Talia. Thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. I'm with the Civil Society for Business and Professional Women, and we've done a bit of advocacy work around the Bangkok rules and the rights of women prisoners to sexual and reproductive health rights, among other things. Is that a space that UNFPA is in?
Well, thank you, because I think for women prisoners, for people who are detained, who are incarcerated, the refrain is the same, that human rights have to be respected. And there's almost like a double vulnerability when you've lost your normal freedom and you are under a regime that's dictated to you. So for us, I think the work that we do with women prisoners is in concert with the normative so-called agencies of the United Nations, our High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also those who are entrusted with making sure that the judiciary system works in favor of anybody who's imprisoned. There are special circumstances, however, if someone is pregnant while they're incarcerated, and also the ability to protect people who are incarcerated from gender-based violence from within. I really feel that there's a lot more that needs to be done and that we should be doing. And this is one aspect of what we're examining in terms of who is left behind most and furthest. When you look at actually the woman in a typical peacetime, shall we say, environment who's imprisoned, usually they were disadvantaged from very early on. And the choices that they make in terms of the transgressions and crimes that they commit sometimes are also gendered. So the attitude towards sex work, for example, the attitude towards economic disempowerment, where you're willing to take a chance and do something that somebody who has resources is not going to be shoplifting or forging a check or whatever it is. And also for the drug and sex economy, which can be very, very violent and coercive. Sometimes when women can prove that they were under the influence of someone, you know, a male who was coercing them, it's not really taken in the same weight because they have accompanying drug addiction or other factors. So I believe that there's a lot to be done in the human rights sphere of looking at root causes is always going to be protective and beneficial, but once someone is incarcerated, trying to guarantee their dignity even while they're, in a situation where they're imprisoned. Thanks.
Just thinking one more there. Are there any other? What should we take two at once? So one here and then one at the back. If that's right.
Kia ora, good afternoon. I'm Borj. I'm originally from the Philippines, but I'm pursuing a master's here in New Zealand. Back in the Philippines, there are a lot of issues affecting sexual and reproductive health rights. One, for instance, is that abortion is still illegal. Comprehensive sex education is not yet integrated in our education curriculum, and access to products and services are kind of not being discussed in terms of LGBTQIA plus community. And I think all of these are rooted with Philippines being a predominantly Christian country. So my question is, at what point do you think should religious fundamentalism be set aside so that we can push through with progressive changes?
Yeah, should we just get the last one at the top, Mel? That's right.
Hi, thank you for your time today. I'm just wondering specifically for Right Honourable Helen Clark, how you navigated the tension between the push for localism in the development sector with your background from a wealthy Western country, whether there was any tension in that sort of relationship, and I guess more broadly for the UN bureaucracy as well. It seems to sort of over-index on people from Western Europe, people from North America, and what the implications of that might be for this issue. Thank you.
These are great questions. These are great questions. Thank you so much. Let me say that there are many religious fundamentalisms, and there's also huge opportunity for people of faith who, after all, are motivated by compassion and caring to look at what we can do to make life better. In our case, for UNFPA, we always look at life through the lens of an adolescent girl. She's got to navigate that adolescence in a way that she can succeed in getting her education. Human relationships are so important during that period. And also you define your sexual identity during that period. It is a non-binary world, and this is something which is new in a sense. In a sense, it's as old as time, but it's new that people who are non-binary are asserting their rights visibly with pride, which we might not have necessarily had before. In some of our cultures, actually, non-binary status was normal, natural, accepted. It's never been a problem. But in this time, the polarization and actually the victimization of people who seem on the surface to be vulnerable, like transgender people, has become a theme, which is another thing that we have to confront and call out and make sure that we bring the proper evidence to bear. I don't feel that as UNFPA or as the United Nations, it's really up to us to decide when religious fundamentalisms will be set aside. However, because we do espouse human rights, what we're doing as UNFPA this year for the 30th anniversary of Cairo, we're actually trying to be a little more imaginative about talking to people who are silent and we don't know which view they have. So it's very important for me and for my team, you know, in Tanzania and in Bolivia and everywhere around the world to quote unquote cross the street and talk to that person of whatever faith, because whether it's Islam or Christianity or, you list all of the religions, we've joined coalitions of people of faith who run schools, they run hospitals, they show their caring through service, to say that there are many aspects that we need to discuss or to respectfully agree to disagree, but that we should work together on points of commonality. And hopefully that builds a bridge. This is true for individuals as well as countries. And Helen, I don't know, Helen Clark led our biggest agency by far, the United Nations Development Programme, very skillfully when she was at the UN. For us, many countries are silent, even though they love what UNFPA is doing at home. The drumbeat when there are negotiations on paragraph 8, where the comma should be or whatever, they benefit from the services we deliver. They know that if UNFPA is not there to advocate for LGBTIQ issues, certain conditions would multiply. They also appreciate that, we're pretty honest in terms of gathering data, doing the research, and showing the difference it makes to work on SRHR. So now we see part of our role this year is outreach to those member states to say, we'd appreciate it if you would speak up when these debates about the wisdom of teen pregnancy are going on. Your country has a high rate. We've been able to do interventions together, which you've co-signed in your country program agreements with us. And please speak up. I mean, it's time to assert that this makes a difference for your budget, for your well-being of the people of the country. The last thing I'd like to say, too, is that because faith is so important in people's lives, I personally have seen, like my family, I'm from Panama, is as Catholic as you come. I went to Catholic school, the whole thing. When one of our first cousins came out as lesbian, oh my goodness, you thought the sun was never going to set or rise again. But now, let's say 18, 20 years later, the child of this cousin is like, so embraced. Our attitudes of those who were hostile have really changed. And so I have to hold out hope that people, just like I have changed, and I mean, over time, it's like the girl I was describing who's bullied online. If she retreats and she says, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna, take the course, I'm gonna drop out or whatever, the other side is kind of won. So I think we have to insist that, look, okay, you're not there yet, but give this person their dignity. Make sure that, we're not gonna isolate people and try to stigmatize them. So my hope for people everywhere is that we understand that, as unique human beings, we're all going to contribute. We're all going to have, hopefully, positive effects, and we should not be overwhelmed by these anti-choice, anti-rights groupings. Their movement is artificial, and it's well-funded and orchestrated and manipulated. So, we study money flows for that reason, to better understand why these memes and whatever and disinformation are replicated simultaneously all over the world. I mean, it's not organic. It's actually important for us to speak up. So thank you for asking that question.
Just a quick reply to the one at the back. I would say that the overwhelming majority of UNDP staff were not from OECD countries like New Zealand. Just overwhelming. We're actually quite a small percentage of the staff. I mean, an organisation like UNDP had, I think, 129 country offices and some sub-offices. And for the most part, the only international staff, who may themselves have been from a developing country, were the resident representative and the deputy. Everyone else was local staff, and they were serving their country through, in effect, UNDP as like a development consultancy. And the work that you were funded to do was always in partnership with a local partner. For example, a big elections portfolio, you would be funding the work of the Election Commission of of a country, or work with parliamentarians. You'd be funding through the parliament. So I think that's really important. I do think in the past, and maybe to some extent today, some of the humanitarian workforce has been a bit the white male stereotype, but increasingly that's changed a lot too. You're seeing much more diversity at that front end of humanitarian response too, and it's just so important that you see, you know, the local identity come through what's happening in your programs, and everything is context specific. I was just going to make one point following what Natalia said about the LGBTQI issues. I'm really concerned at some of the legislation being passed in Africa. The latest being Ghana, really draconian legislation, which is making it a criminal offence, I think, actually to say that you're gay. I mean, it's horrific. This follows Uganda and some others. So I don't know whether you've got any comment on. Has the president overruled it?
Yes.
Yeah.
He has,
Okay.
yeah.
But you know,
still,
it's
the
coming
fact that
through
it
these
goes that
parliaments.
far.
You know that it's so just to be watched, I think, because it has dire consequences for populations.
Indeed.
Back to you, Hayden.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. That's wonderful. To thank you properly, I'm going to invite Carly Mercer to come up and say some concluding remarks. Thank you.
It's really true though, Helen. They're picking
Tēnā
up.
koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. Ko Kāli Mercer toko ingoa. Wasn't it fantastic? It was just, it was a really inspiring and engaging hour, I think. I say on behalf of all of us here today. It was a real privilege to have you both here to share some of your deep wisdom on what's happening in the SRHR space, so thank you. It felt like a real whistle-stop tour. We got through an awful lot in an hour, 30 years since Cairo, and all the great progress that have been made since then, but also many of the things that still have to be worked on progress, especially some of those really big issues that we're all facing at the moment, like climate change, conflict in many countries, inequality, mis and disinformation, and how those link to sexual reproductive health rights was really fascinating to hear about. So I've been asked, I'm at the Helen Clark Foundation, by the way. Hamish introduced me earlier, but just in case you've forgotten, I've been asked to thank everyone. I wanted to start with thanking you guys for coming and for giving up an hour of your time to engage with this really, really important kaupapa work. So thank you. I also wanted to thank Te Herenga Waka, the Victoria University, for letting us use their space and for their ongoing support of events on important topics like these. Thank you also, a big thank you to New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, particularly Executive Director Hamish McDougall and his lovely team who've been so helpful tonight for hosting the event today. As you know, NZIIA does really valuable work fostering expert debate and discussion on a range of really important issues of global significance and how they relate to Aotearoa New Zealand. So great that we can have this event today. Thank you for that. And Dr. Kamen's visit today was arranged by MFAT and the UN Population Fund, so massive thank you to you and welcome to your team who you've brought with you, Natalia. So thank you. Last but certainly not least, the speakers. I want to start with thanking Helen Clark, who, as you'll know, is patron of the organisation Helen Clark Foundation that I work for, and has travelled down from Waihi today for this.
Thank you so much.
Has prioritised this coming down here. So thank you. While I'm here, it might be a good time to mention that the Helen Clark Foundation is actually turning 5 this month. A foundation that Helen set up, and
That's amazing.
you know, we've
I'm
come a
so
long
glad
way
you did
in
that.
those 5 years. I haven't been there the whole time, but we're able to contribute to all kinds of really important public policy issues. And we actually have a membership special on at the moment for our 5-year anniversary, so take a look at our website. Sorry, Hamish. Just lobbing that in there a little bit.
Advertorial there.
And then finally to you, Dr. Natalia Kamening, thank you so much for travelling such a huge distance to be here today. She said she's been on a tour of 5 countries and she couldn't remember all of them. But just thank you so much for prioritising coming us here and all the way at the end of the universe. And thank you for your tireless work in this space, for your great talk, and for holding the banner for all of us. Thank you very much.